Hey there, I'm Ryan from Deeper Than the Backlog podcast, where we talk about all things agile. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about part 3 of our Introduction to Kanban series. And you can go back and look at part 2 and part 1 either on our website, deeperthanthebacklog.com. You can also see it out on our YouTube channel. And then if you just prefer to listen to it via your favorite podcast framework or streaming service, you can listen to it out on Apple or Spotify. I think we're out on iHeartRadio as well, and we keep pushing out to additional platforms. So feel free to listen in or go view one of the previous videos. We talked about part 1, visualizing flow or visualizing your workflow. We went through how to set up a Kanban board for your workflow. What do you do with columns, stages, and then swim lanes, which are your rows in your Kanban board? We talked about various ways to do swim lanes. So you can check out that episode. In part 2, we talked about WIP limits, WIP, work in progress limits. How do they help you? How do they help teams be more efficient in your workflow, and essentially kind of advocate for that pull model of work where you don't work on something new until the work item you're working on is completed and moved to the next stage. So very critical, very important part of Kanban and how to modulate work going through the flow and making it more efficient. And then today, going on to part 3, we're going to talk about managing flow or improving flow. So this is a little short snippet we'll talk through on our example Kanban board about how do you improve your flow. And there's a couple areas we want to focus on when we think about improving flow. One of them is that work in progress or WIP limit. So it's a pretty trivial thing to do, but what you really want to look for is, are you abiding by your WIP limits? And in our case, if we look at the Kanban board here, we're sharing in the in progress column stage, we have a 2. So we have a WIP limit or work in progress limit of 2. So we just want to make sure whenever we're glancing at that board, whether it's team, yourself, your family, there's no more than 2 tickets, tasks, features, requirements sitting in that column. And if there are more than 2, you want to call that out and then figure out how do you reduce that back down to 2. Does something go back into to do? Do we swarm as a team or a family to try and focus on one thing and move it forward because it's almost complete? A lot of different ways to look at it, but the goal is stay at or below your work in progress limits. And then same thing for waiting. You can see on our board in the waiting column, we have 1 task in the waiting. So we are good there. If we were tempted to move another task over to waiting, that would be a no-no. We'd either have to figure out how to get the current task out of waiting, or that other task solve the problem. Don't put it in waiting. Figure out how to solve it so it doesn't go into the waiting column or stage of your flow. So that one's a pretty basic, pretty trivial, and that's from our part 2. You can go back and listen to that on how to define work in progress limits. And you have some variables there. Also, you want to always readdress that from your actual throughput of your Kanban board and how things are functioning. So you observe, you figure out the right work in progress limits, and then you put those in place, and then you follow them. So the second part is looking for work bottlenecks, or essentially workflow backups, or where's work piling up. In our case, if we look at this board, we're pretty good. Done column's complete, so you don't worry about work piling up there. That's actually a very positive thing. You definitely want that. Waiting, you want to have that minimized at your WIP limit or lower. In progress, we're good here. We have 2 tasks. I have 1, cut the lawn. Christina has 1, to feed her goats. So we have 2. We're good on our work in progress limit there. And then we have a bunch of things in to do. So we don't really have a bottleneck. If anything, we just have too many to do tasks piling up. But that's what you want. Anytime you define tasks, you want them in your to-do list, or you can also call that a backlog of work. And then you just want to reprioritize that anytime you're adding items there. So this is a good example of a functional, healthy, flowing Kanban. Now, if you started to see things pile up in your waiting, like say, for example, we had 5 people in our family. So we had 5 swim lanes, rows on our Kanban board, and then everybody had one ticket in their waiting. So that would be a major problem. Two problems are actually. Number one is that if there were 5 people, 5 swim lanes, and we had 5 tasks in the waiting, we're 4 tasks over our work in progress limit because our work in progress limit is 1. So that's a major problem. We didn't follow our work in progress limit. Number two is that we have work piling up in our waiting, which means we're doing a lot of work we're dependent on something else for, and we can't actually complete, or there's some roadblock that's preventing us from completing it. So in those situations, you actually want to shift the family, team, your personal focus into trying to help remove or resolve those roadblocks, because you don't want your waiting column to be your bottleneck. You want most of your work items to be in to do or in progress, and you don't want the in progress to be sitting too long. You want to be able to complete tasks, move them on to done or your completed column. So that would be an example where a waiting column, two problems you would flag. One, you have a flow problem. Everything's backing up on waiting. You have a lot of dependencies. And number two is you're not following your work in progress limit, which is 1. So you should not have any more than 1 task in that column or stage at any point in time. So that would be an example of not following some of the managing flow or improving flow processes that hinders your work experience. Another one is how quickly tasks or work items move through your flow. And the easiest way I find to do this is to mark on your actual sticky note or card or whatever you're using to track your task, the amount of time or effort that went into completing it. So you kind of have a history and track record to know if you're improving, staying the same, or getting worse. So in this example, we have one item over in the to do or over in the done column. So your completed column. Right here, we can see send HOA board meeting agenda. And what you can do is very easily just mark on your card or task that, hey, that took half an hour. So I'll just put a little note there that took 5 hours. And then from there, you have history. You can always go back and look at that. You can track it, and you can see if you're improving or getting worse. And the idea is you want to stay the same or get better. All of agile processes are about assessing, taking feedback, and figuring out how to improve or get better going forward. So the idea is that you don't really want to get worse than half an hour, but if you were planning work and say in 2 weeks from now you had to do another board meeting, HOA board meeting agenda and send that out, it's roughly going to take you half hour because you've done that before. You have a track record, and you've noted it before, and it's part of your analysis and history of how that work flows through the Kanban. Now, another thing you can do, it's a little more advanced, but you can actually track the time it goes from each stage. So you could on the ticket or card or sticky note, post-it note, put, to do to in progress, it took 1 day. In progress to done, it took half hour. So you could track and figure out how to become more efficient moving work from the various stages. Now, in a simple Kanban like this, to do, in progress, waiting, done, probably not a huge amount of value of doing that. But as you build more complex Kanban boards and you have several columns, I've seen teams that have had upwards of 8, 9 different stages or columns in their Kanban. It becomes really important to understand where are the bottlenecks and how long does it take work to transition from, say, stage A to stage B, or in progress to I'm waiting for the business to test this and give us a check off that it's complete. And that way you can get a little bit more granular, detailed analytics to figure out, one, where you're at, what your throughput times are, and then two, how to improve going forward. The other thing to note is the way we've done this here by putting 0.5 hours or a half hour on our card, we tracked from the point of starting that in progress to completion. And that's called cycle time. Very important metric in Kanban. There's two key metrics when you look at flow. There's cycle time, which is when did I start working on that task, and then when did it move into done. And in this case, it took half an hour, 30 minutes to move from in progress to done. I picked it up 30 minutes later, it was complete. The other metric is lead time. And lead time is more important from a requester's point of view or a client or a customer's point of view. And lead time is just the difference between when they made that ask. Someone said, "Hey, Ryan, can you send out the HOA board meeting agenda so we can review it before the meeting?" So that was the request being made. And then when did that complete? And in almost all cases, lead time is going to be longer than your cycle time. The only time it would be the same would be if you started working on it immediately. So say someone asked me to send out the board meeting minutes or board meeting agenda, and I started immediately. At that point, your cycle and lead time would be identical. Your lead time will never be quicker than your cycle time. So hopefully that makes sense, because you can't start working on something not knowing what you're being asked to work on. So I don't think there's a situation that exists where your lead time would ever be quicker than your cycle time. But very important. Cycle time's more for the team. It's more for you, a personal metric for your own tasks. Lead time is more to assess how long it takes to get something back to a client, customer, or completion based on when they made that request. And then they can better plan timelines and roadmaps and things like that. So cycle time, lead time, we'll talk more about those in future episodes, but you want to note those so you know where you're at, and then also assess, analyze, and know how to improve going forward. So that's another way to improve your flow. And all of these really just help you become more efficient and more predictable. So for example, before doing Kanban, I may not have any idea how long it would take me to write up and send out the board meeting agenda, or for example, cut the lawn. Say I've never cut the lawn before. First time I'm using a Kanban, I put it up on my Kanban, never cut the lawn before. Go through the process, move it into in progress, go cut the lawn, come back. Hey, it took me an hour and a half. Cool. Now you have a metric, a baseline. You know that when you do any type of planning cycle, prioritization cycle, depending on when you're trying to organize or structure your work, you know that that's going to take an hour and a half. You also know that maybe there's ways to improve that. Maybe if you put two people on your Kanban and you cut the back lawn, and you're lucky enough to have another lawnmower and your son cuts the front lawn, you know that you can cut down on that overall time doing that in parallel. So different ways to dice it, look at it, but it's a very important metric to really assess flow and throughput. And all of this is really just to make more accuracy and more predictability in your workflows. And then how do you improve over time? And that kind of leads us to our part 4, which we'll talk about in the next episode. And that's really around making process policies. So defining, for example, how do you work on items in various stages? Is there certain checklists you need to do? Maybe even on the specific requirements or tasks, there's certain ways you structure it or checklists you have to check off before you can say, hey, this task can move to the next column. You can define rules and processes for swim lanes. That's your rows going across. You can define them for stages. You can define them more generically for what is the definition of complete. So for example, how do you know something is done and you're able to move it to the done stage or column on your Kanban? Maybe, for example, a business associate has to check off and approve it, or someone has to sign a document, or someone has to provide feedback, or, maybe there's a testing phase. Someone has to test something if you're building a product or a solution and you need feedback. So that written feedback might be a checklist item before you can move it to a done stage or column. So we'll talk about that next, making process policies. So look for that coming soon. We are out on various social media platforms. You can find us out on YouTube. Look at a couple of our videos. We have all of the Kanban videos for the Introduction to Kanban series. You can check us out on our website, learn more about Christine and I, deeperthanthebacklog.com. And you can also find us on Instagram, occasional posts there. And of course, every Thursday we release out an episode of Deeper Than the Backlog podcast. So look for those coming out on your favorite podcast platform. All right, take care. We'll see you next Thursday. Bye.